It's like we're all standing on shifting ground, isn't it? This feeling that the world, the way we've always known it, is being rewritten right before our eyes. And, the stuff you sent over about this great American reset, it really hits on that. Like, boom, this is happening. So let's dive right in. What are the core changes we're talking about here?
Yeah, what really jumps out from these sources is how forceful this great American reset is. No tiptoeing around. It lays out a pretty clear argument. Under this 47th president, there's been a hard turn towards this America First strategy. And the documents go deep on how this is reshaping, global economics, shaking up the whole system that's been in place since World War II, that Pax Americana thing. The sources point to trade wars, this big tech race with China, and even our relationships with traditional allies getting strained. It's a pretty big shakeup.
And it's not just playing out on the world stage, right? The material gets into some pretty big domestic policy changes, too. I mean, we're talking shutting down agencies like USAID, the Department of Education, some serious shifts within the Department of Justice, too, all under this banner of draining the swamp, this idea of redeeming the American Republic. Feels like a really fundamental shift in how America sees itself, both at home and globally.
Absolutely. And one of the things I found really interesting is how the source material presents this not as some brand new thing. It frames this great American reset as the latest chapter in a much older story, this ongoing tug of war in American history. They call it a clash between American nationalists and a British free trade oligarchy. And get this, they trace it all the way back to the Civil War.
Yeah, that really caught my eye, too. It's like, wow, is there this whole other economic layer to the Civil War?
Yeah.
A battle between two completely different systems. The American system wanting to build up industry here at home, break free from British influence, versus the British system, all about free trade, smaller government, that kind of thing. Makes you think about that period in a whole new way.
It does. And the sources go into how Lincoln's Republican Party, they were all in on this American system. They really wanted to make the U.S. a global industrial power. But the narrative they present is that, British influence didn't just disappear after the war through various means. Some of it's pretty dramatic, honestly.
Yeah.
The text even mentions this idea of an Anglo-American imperial alliance being floated around. Point is, this British oligarchy supposedly clawed its way back into a position of power in the U.S., influencing economics and politics. So you could see what's happening now as this old conflict bubbling back up to the surface.
So fast forward to today. The argument is that the Trumpian wing of the GOP, they represent this modern revival of that old tension, a pushback against that perceived British influence that never really went away. But the source also points out that the deep state, and here they're talking about this powerful, unelected network of bureaucrats and financiers pulling the strings behind the scenes, their control over American banking and debt is stronger than ever. That's a pretty tough obstacle to overcome, wouldn't you say?
For sure. It definitely complicates things. Now, if we tie this historical thread to the post-World War II world order, well, first you have the Bretton Woods Agreement. This created the IMF, the World Bank, and really established the U.S. dollar as the world's go-to currency. Then, under Nixon, you have the shift to the petrodollar system. Oil, that most crucial commodity, is priced in dollars, solidifying global demand. The source material makes a pretty fascinating case that this entire American empire, this dollar dominance, it's partly built on trade deficits. That might sound counterintuitive, but their argument is that if America actually reversed those deficits, which is a key goal of these American nationalists, it could destabilize the whole system. It's like this underlying tension built into the way global power works right now. It's a trade-off then, right? A strong industrial base at home or maintaining global dominance through a system that, according to this view, requires the U.S. to be a net importer and therefore run deficits. So you've got the American nationalists looking inward versus the globalists wanting to keep the current international order with the U.S. as the linchpin, even if it means being deep in debt.
Right. And to make things even more complex, the source also brings up this whole historical angle about Wall Street. They describe it as this British-American oligarchy that actually backed communist movements in Russia and China. Their claim is that this oligarchy has had a hand in shaping U.S. policy for a long time. They contrast this with, Russia today trying to reclaim its imperial glory and the Trumpian GOP pushing back against this same elite. It's a very specific interpretation of history, for sure. Definitely a unique perspective. And the material doesn't shy away from the current situation either. It points out that neither the U.S., burdened by all that debt, nor Russia, facing sanctions and war, is really in a position to dictate a new world order on their own. Then you have China, this rising power challenging U.S. dominance, but at the same time, so deeply entangled with the American economy. Which brings us to this reset button idea. The source argues that these American nationalists within the Trumpian GOP, they're using America First policies, particularly trade wars and tariffs, as their tool to hit that reset. And, trade has always been this huge factor in how global power shifts, right?
Oh, absolutely. The source takes us way back to the historical dominance of India and China. Their wealth-attracted European explorers led to the formation of powerful trading companies like the East India Company. At first, it was all about trade. But the text points out how the East India Company started imposing unequal terms, exploiting resources. It set the stage for conflicts like the Opium Wars in China. It's a good reminder of how trade imbalances can be used as a tool of control and domination.
But then, after World War II, things shifted. We saw a move away from those more blatant colonial practices towards these multilateral institutions like GATT and later the WTO. The goal was to level the playing field, promote global trade, create a system with rules everyone agreed on.
Right. But then comes 2016. Brexit happens, Trump gets elected, and the source argues that this was a turning point. This whole globalization trend starts to reverse. Free trade suddenly becomes this super controversial idea. Protectionism is back on the rise.
Exactly. This America First policy, as it's described, is a clear break from that post-World War II order. And ironically, it's the U.S., the architect of that order, that's now leading the charge away from it. The source suggests this puts us on a very precarious path, maybe even on the brink of a full-blown trade war that could have huge consequences for everyone.
And they get into the specifics of President Trump's grievances. These massive trade deficits, particularly with China, $375 billion in 2017 alone. That's huge. But the source also points to significant imbalances with Japan, Germany, even our neighbors, Canada and Mexico. It paints a picture of an American economy heavily reliant on imports.
And the source breaks down the main drivers of these deficits, with consumer goods and automobiles being the biggest culprits, imports far exceeding exports in those areas. It's worth noting, though, as the source does, that the U.S. does have a pretty sizable trade surplus in services. So that helps offset the overall deficit a bit. But I'm curious, what does the source say are the key reasons behind these imbalances in the first place?
Well, they argue that these persistent deficits have caused some major problems for the U.S., rising national debt, for one. Then there's the decline of American manufacturing as companies move production to countries with cheaper labor, like China, this whole deindustrialization thing. And ultimately, it led to higher unemployment. The source ties these trade imbalances directly to the economic anxieties that fueled Trump's campaign, his whole message against free trade. They even draw a parallel to how the British Empire used to benefit from similar lopsided trade relationships with its colonies.
So to tackle these perceived imbalances, the Trump administration went on the offensive. They started slapping tariffs on imported goods from all sorts of countries. The course specifically highlights July 6, 2018 as the start of the U.S.-China trade war. The initial tariffs, they were aimed at Chinese goods related to their Made in China 2025 plan, things like aerospace, IT, robotics, all those advanced industries.
And China didn't just sit there and take it. They fired back right away with their own tariffs on $34 billion worth of American goods. And they were smart about it, targeting agricultural products like soybeans and pork, which hit key constituencies in the U.S. Plus, they went after automobiles. And it wasn't just China. Canada, Mexico, the EU, India, Japan, they all retaliated with tariffs on U.S. exports. It became this tit-for-tat trade war, escalating pretty quickly.
And as the source points out, the U.S. then threatened to up the ante even further, talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in additional tariffs on China, even targeting EU car imports. That kind of escalation, that's exactly what throws global supply chains into chaos and starts to drag down economic growth worldwide. And it's here that this thing called the Triffin dilemma comes into play. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Think of it this way. Because the U.S. dollar is the world's main reserve currency, the currency most countries use for international transactions, there's always a high demand for dollars globally. To meet that demand, the U.S. has to keep pumping dollars into the global system, often by running these trade deficits. It's a bit of a catch-22. The very system that makes the U.S. financially powerful kind of forces it into these trade imbalances, which can hurt domestic industries. It's like being the world's banker. But you constantly have to lend out more than you take in to keep things running.
So the dollar's global dominance actually makes American exports pricier, less competitive. And at the same time, it requires the U.S. to keep buying up imports to supply the world with those dollars. And the source is saying this trade war could end up shaking the foundations of the entire global monetary system we've had since Bretton Woods. And in the long run, it could even weaken America's position as a superpower. That's a pretty huge potential consequence.
Yeah, it's a big deal. The source also digs into the U.S. perspective on China's Made in China 2025 initiative. They highlight concerns, like those raised by Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, about China stealing American intellectual property on a massive scale. Estimates are in the hundreds of billions of dollars per year. The argument is that China is using its trade surplus to pour money into key high-tech sectors, trying to dominate those industries and become a technological leader. The tariffs, from this viewpoint, were also a way to try and slow China's progress in these areas.
Which then prompted China to consider its own countermoves. The source mentions a few possibilities. They could hit U.S. agricultural exports even harder, buy their oil and gas from somewhere else like Russia or Iran, go after American service industries, even target big U.S. tech companies operating in China, like Boeing and Apple.
And beyond those direct economic responses, the source brings up these non-economic stealth weapons. That could mean China selling off a bunch of its U.S. Treasury bonds, which could send interest rates in the U.S. soaring. Or they could restrict the supply of rare earth minerals crucial for all sorts of high-tech and military applications. China basically controls the global supply of those.
But the source makes it clear this trade war is a risky game for China, too. It could hurt their export-driven economy, lead to factory closures, unemployment, all sorts of things that could cause instability within China. And while weakening their currency, the yuan, might make their exports cheaper and offset some of the tariffs, it also puts China's own massive debt bubble at risk. Sounds like a pretty high-stakes poker game, with both sides holding some strong cards.
It really is a lose-lose situation, as the source emphasizes. We've already seen the fallout, American farmers struggling with tariffs on soybeans and pork, the U.S. hitting back with things like that huge fine on ZTE. It just shows how quickly things can escalate, how interconnected everything is.
And it's not just an economic story, right? The source even suggests that Trump's trade policies might embolden nationalist and populist movements in Europe, particularly in countries that are already wary of Germany's influence within the EU. It raises concerns that the EU could become even more fragmented, with nationalist sentiment pushing for countries to go it alone.
And the historical parallels are pretty striking. The source points to the Canadian-American trade wars back in the late 1800s. Back then, U.S. protectionist measures actually pushed some American businesses to relocate to Canada to avoid tariffs.
Sounds familiar, right? And then there's a period after World War I. The U.S. went isolationist, America first. It culminated in the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which was a disaster. Most historians agree it made the Great Depression even worse, and some argue it even contributed to the rise of those nationalist movements in Europe that eventually led to World War II. History has a way of repeating itself, and it's not always pretty. So if we try to sum up this whole Great American Reset, based on what your sources are saying, it really comes down to this fundamental clash between nationalist and globalist worldviews.
Yeah.
And these trade wars are like the main battleground for that clash. And the potential consequences are huge. We could be looking at major global economic disruption, a complete reshuffling of the world order as we know it.
Exactly. And what the source really drives home is that these aren't new struggles. They're these deep historical currents resurfacing in a new era, shaped by new technologies, playing out on a truly global scale. It's a lot to wrap our heads around.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about. What are the long-term implications of all this? Not just for the U.S., but for everyone.
That's the big question, isn't it? Given the historical track record of trade wars and how interconnected the global economy is today, what unforeseen consequences might come from this great American reset? And at the end of the day, who's going to pay the price for all this disruption? Okay, so you know that feeling you get, right? When the world feels a little bit wobbly, things aren't quite as stable or predictable as they used to be. Well, it's 2025.
Yeah.
And we got this really fascinating set of articles and analyses from a listener, and they're all about how the global order is changing and shifting under President Trump's second term.
Absolutely. And we're diving deep today into what some are calling the Trump 2.0 agenda.
Oh, wow. Trump 2.0.
Yeah. And basically what we want to do is really get to the heart of your sources. You know, what are the key takeaways? How is this administration seen as fundamentally changing the international system? And also, what effects is this having here at home?
That's right.
That's what we're going to try to unpack.
Yeah, so it seems like the big argument that's coming out of all of these articles is that Pax Americana, that period after World War II where there was relative peace and U.S. dominance,
right,
that is basically being dismantled. Well, and the thinking seems to be that the Trump administration no longer sees it as, in America's best interest.
No longer serving America's core national interest.
Right, exactly.
And what's really fascinating is how your sources point to all these different ways that this dismantling is happening. It's not just one thing. It's multifaceted.
Yeah, you see this constant theme, right? Of the U.S. stepping back from these organizations, these multilateral institutions that they actually helped build.
Yeah.
Like the WHO, the Paris Accord, the UN Human Rights Council, UNRWA. It's not just the list of organizations, but it's what it signals. This move towards unilateral action.
Exactly.
The U.S. is saying, look, we see these organizations more as constraints than as, assets.
Yeah, it's not about these big international players either.
Yeah.
One of the articles you sent actually pointed to the fact that DEI mandates within the Department of Defense have been rescinded. So that signals a real shift in priorities. Domestically, but it has these international implications as well.
Absolutely. And then there's the trade wars, which feel like a really big part of this whole shift, Yeah. Tariffs on Mexico and Canada at first because of immigration and fentanyl. And even though they got resolved pretty quickly, after assurances of cooperation, it still suggests that the approach is very transactional.
For sure.
It's not so much about those long-standing alliances based on, shared values.
Right.
It's more about using leverage to get what you want.
Right now.
Right in that moment.
Absolutely.
On those specific issues.
Yeah. And when it comes to China, it seems like a much bigger battle.
Oh, yeah.
The 10% tariffs. And then China retaliated with tariffs on American LNG gas.
Right.
Then there were antitrust investigations against U.S. tech companies like Google.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a serious economic showdown.
Oh, absolutely.
And, the U.S. is saying they're open to talks, but then China's taken it to the WTO.
It's complicated.
It is complicated.
Yeah.
But I think the takeaway here is that things are moving away from this global consensus on free trade. And instead, we're seeing a more, like I said, transactional, leverage-based approach to international economic relations.
And then you've got these 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum looming, which could really impact China, India, even allies like Canada.
Yeah.
And then there's the fear of China, dumping cheap steel in other markets.
Flooding the market.
Flooding the market, exactly.
Yeah, so if we take a step back and look at the big picture.
Okay.
It really does seem like the Trump administration is saying this whole post-World War II order just doesn't work for the U.S. anymore.
Right.
And your sources even suggest that they might even pull out of the WTO eventually.
Wow.
But to understand the why behind all of this, we have to look at Secretary of State Marco Rubio's confirmation hearing in January 2025.
Yes. Your sources include some really interesting excerpts from that.
Really illuminating.
Yeah.
So he starts by, acknowledging the goals of the post-World War II order and some of its successes like stability, the growth of democracy and prosperity in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and the end of the Cold War. So he's not completely dismissing it.
Right. He's not saying it was all bad.
Right.
Yeah.
But then he takes this sharp turn.
Yes.
He talks about what he calls the dangerous delusion of a liberal world order.
Yeah, and it's important to clarify what we mean by liberal world order.
Right. It's not just American liberalism.
Right.
It's that whole post-World War II system built on these international institutions, free trade, and democratic values led by the U.S.
Yes.
And Rubio is saying that this whole idea that all countries would eventually join this Western-led democratic club and forget their own national identities was just fundamentally flawed.
And that feels like a really crucial point, the rejection of this universal values-based foreign policy.
Exactly.
And instead it's this return to a more traditional nation-first approach.
America first.
America first,
yeah.
Right.
And he's saying that other countries, especially China, have been acting in their own self-interest the whole time.
Taking advantage,
reaping the benefits of this global order without holding up their end of the bargain.
And he doesn't mince words. He talks about lying, cheating, hacking, stealing.
Yeah, strong accusations.
Yeah.
A real sense of, grievance and betrayal.
Absolutely. And he goes on to talk about the dictators in Moscow, Tehran, and Pyongyang.
Oh, yeah.
These destabilizing forces that are aligning with terror groups, using their veto power at the UN, even threatening the world with nuclear weapons.
He paints a pretty bleak picture.
He does.
And his point seems to be that this post-war order isn't just out of date, it's actually being used against the U.S.
Right. It's a threat.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so he concludes by saying that we're in this moment of huge geopolitical instability.
A crisis point.
Yeah.
And that America needs to shift back to putting its own interests first.
Above everything else. Right. And then in another interview that you provided in your sources, Secretary Rubio kind of doubles down on this whole idea
Oh, yeah.
that countries ultimately act in their own self-interest.
Yeah.
He uses examples like China, Russia, Chile.
Classic realist perspective, right?
Yeah.
Countries do what's best for them.
Right.
That's the main driving force in international relations.
Yeah, and so partnerships and alliances, they're not based on some like idealistic vision.
Yeah.
They're about converging interests.
Right. And then you use diplomacy when those interests clash.
Right, exactly. And he talks about how the post-Cold War era was this kind of anomaly.
Yeah.
Where the U.S. was this like unipolar power, the only superpower.
Right.
And he says that we're moving back to a multipolar world.
Inevitably.
Inevitably, yeah, with powers like China and Russia rising and rogue states like Iran and North Korea still being a threat.
Yeah. It makes things much more complex.
Oh, way more complex.
Than during the Cold War.
Yeah, absolutely. So putting it all together, it seems like what the Trump administration is doing is this massive reset of the global order and of American foreign policy.
A fundamental shift.
Yeah, they're moving away from being the global policeman, the architect of a rules-based system.
Yeah.
And they're saying, America first.
America first.
We're going to look after our own interests.
Exactly.
Right. And it's really interesting that you sent this book from 2016 called The New Global Order, which predicted this kind of reset. And it talks about this concept of multipolarity in bipolarity.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like a new Cold War.
Between the U.S. and China.
Between the U.S. and China, exactly. But with other major players like India and Russia having a lot of influence.
It's a Cold War.
Yeah.
But much more complex.
Much more complex than the original Cold War.
Right.
And it suggests that there's this whole intellectual framework behind these policy shifts.
Definitely.
You know, the idea that make America great again isn't just a slogan. It's a strategy to put American national interests first.
Ahead of the globalists.
Ahead of the globalists, yeah. And what they call this free trade British oligarchy of Wall Street and London nexus.
Wow.
Yeah, I know it's a mouthful.
Yeah.
But your sources actually go so far as to paint this picture of an extreme outcome where the U.S. completely withdraws from international bodies like the WTO, the UN, and pursues this isolationist path relying on its own military and economic might. And this isn't just about foreign policy either. It's also about domestic issues like reshaping institutions like the Department of Justice and USAID.
There's a domestic reset happening too.
Exactly. And it's all laid out in this document called Agenda 2025.
Agenda 2025.
Okay. And that brings us to the second big theme in your sources, which is this idea of redeeming the American Republic.
So this domestic reset goes hand in hand with the changes in foreign policy.
Absolutely. So the argument is that in order to really unwind this global order, you have to deal with these domestic power structures that are seen as serving the interests of this Anglo-American oligarchy.
And one example that your sources really focus on is USAID.
Yeah, USAID.
For those who may not know, USAID is the U.S. agency that's in charge of international development and humanitarian aid.
Right. So these accusations that it's this like imperial arm of the U.S. government really contradict its stated mission.
Definitely.
And this reported conversation between Elon Musk and President Trump about USAID is really interesting. Musk apparently said that it's beyond repair and should be shut down.
He called it a ball of worms.
The ball of worms, yeah.
That's pretty harsh.
It is, yeah. And the sources go on to say that USAID is involved in foreign interference all over the place, like the Arab Spring, Ukraine, even funding the Eco Health Alliance.
Wow.
And they say that all of this is detailed in books like The New Global Order and The Great Reset.
So there's this suggestion that USAID is connected to American intelligence agencies and even big philanthropic foundations.
Right.
What's interesting is this whole network that they describe where USAID supposedly gives money to huge foundations like Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and then those foundations give money to other NGOs.
Right.
And they mentioned these declassified CIA documents from the 1950s that supposedly show the CIA's relationships with some of these charities.
Right.
Like they were using them for cultural exchange programs and even embedding CIA officers in them.
Wow.
It really raises questions about the lines between government, philanthropy, and intelligence.
Absolutely. And the sources really stress that USAID is essentially the financial arm of the State Department, you know, a key part of this security and intelligence apparatus. And they list all these organizations that they say are funded by USAID, like the Albert Einstein Institute, the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute.
Yeah.
And they're all portrayed as tools for advancing U.S. foreign policy.
They use the example of USAID funding funding Uniter and SCSU in Ukraine.
Right, through pacting.
Through pacting, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's this really controversial information about USAID funding the EcoHealth Alliance.
Yeah.
And their gain-of-function research on coronaviruses at the Wuhan lab.
And just to clarify, gain-of-function research is basically modifying a virus to study what it can do.
Yeah.
And the implication here is that this research might have accidentally caused the COVID-19 pandemic.
And then there's this even bigger allegation that the CIA covered up the truth about the origins of COVID-19
Oh, wow.
to protect USA.
To protect U.S.
And hide the fact that it was funding the Wuhan lab.
Wow.
And they even bring up former USAID Director John Gilligan, who apparently admitted that the CIA had infiltrated the agency.
So they're really painting USA as this shadowy organization.
Definitely.
Yeah, and they go on to list all these other alleged examples of USA meddling in other countries.
Like undermining the government in Venezuela.
Right.
Creating a social media platform in Cuba to stir up rebellion.
Yeah.
And even links to coups in Haiti, Ukraine, Egypt.
It's a lot.
It is.
And then there's the Predicti program.
Yeah.
This partnership between USAID and EcoHealth Alliance that ran from 2009 to 2019.
Right. They were identifying viruses, training people, enhancing labs.
Right.
And the sources are saying that this program gave the CIA a way to get its people into bioresearch facilities all over the world.
Like embedded agents.
Yeah. And they bring up Dr. Andrew Huff.
Right. A former VP at EcoHealth Alliance.
Yeah. And he claims that Dr. Peter Daszak had ties to the CIA.
Wow.
It's a really damning picture they're painting.
It is. So then the sources shift to domestic issues, and they talk about the Department of Education.
Okay.
And they accuse it of being overtaken by woke ideology and the teaching of gender ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And they say that the Trump administration is closing down institutions that promote these ideas.
As a way to reset America.
Yeah, to get back to the core values of the 60s and 70s.
Interesting. And they even bring in this historical perspective with Yuri Bezmenov.
Yes.
He was the guy who warned about the Soviets trying to radicalize the U.S. education system.
Right.
Back during the Cold War.
Yeah, and they're comparing that to what's happening now.
Like the Trump administration is hitting the reset button to get rid of decades of radical thought.
Exactly. And then we get to what the sources call the elephant in the room.
Which is?
The Department of Justice and the FBI.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, they're portrayed as this, like, out-of-control arm of the shadow government.
Serving the Anglo-American oligarchy.
Exactly. And they argue that the FBI has gone way beyond law enforcement.
Right.
It's basically a state within a state.
Wow.
Yeah. And they trace the roots of this power all the way back to this alleged Wall Street London coup that supposedly created J. Edgar Hoover and the modern FBI. And they point to McKinley's assassination in 1901 as this key event that led to the presidencies of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, who then shaped the FBI and Hoover's career.
So they're saying it all goes back to the early 20th century.
Yeah, they trace the FBI back to this small investigative agency that Teddy Roosevelt created.
Within the Department of Justice.
Right.
But they say it had limitations at first.
Yeah, and then they bring up this really interesting detail about Claude Danzy. Well, he was supposedly this British Secret Service agent who was sent to coordinate intelligence in the U.S., and he was running this whole spy network that was initially targeting Irish Americans and other people who were seen as anti-British.
Wow.
Yeah, and they really emphasize how powerful the FBI is, you know, this idea that it can make or break a president.
And then there's J. Edgar Hoover.
Oh, yeah.
Who was in charge for 37 years.
A long time.
A long time, yeah. And they say that U.S. presidents have historically been more afraid of the FBI than of any foreign enemy.
It's a scary thought.
It is, and they give all these examples to show how powerful the FBI is.
Yeah, like Watergate.
Which brought down Nixon.
Right, the investigations into Reagan's administration during Iran-Contra.
Yeah.
And they claim that every president since Lyndon Johnson has had to deal with this really powerful FBI.
Wow.
And they say that this power all comes from Roosevelt giving Hoover the authority to do wiretapping and gather intelligence. And then there are all these stories about presidents clashing with Hoover and the FBI. Yeah, JFK supposedly called Hoover a goddamn sewer.
Wow.
And there were rumors that Hoover had a sex tape of JFK.
Oh, my.
And Truman called the FBI the American Gestapo.
Wow.
And supposedly Hoover supported Dewey in the 1948 election instead of Truman.
Really?
Yeah, and then during the whole anti-communist thing in the late 40s, they say that Hoover went way beyond what Truman authorized him to do. And there's even this claim that Hoover made sure Johnson became president after JFK was assassinated.
Wow.
And that he tried to ruin Bobby Kennedy's political career.
So they're saying Hoover was pulling strings behind the scenes?
Yeah, and then they mentioned that Bush, Obama, and Trump also had problems with the FBI.
So every president has to deal with this powerful force.
Exactly.
Like a constant in American politics.
Yeah, so basically what your sources are saying is that the Trump administration is completely reshaping America's role in the world and also the power structures within the U.S.
A two-pronged approach.
Exactly, and they're pretty clear about the potential consequences.
Yeah, they say that this shift away from the established global order could lead to more chaos and instability in the world,
right,
with China and Russia trying to fill the void.
And disrupting global supply chains.
And the global economy.
Yeah.
And they say that the whole point of this is to free America from the control of this Anglo-American oligarchy.
And make America the top dog again.
Yeah, even if it means scrapping the whole post-World War II system.
Right, and they predict that the world is about to get a lot more turbulent.
As America retreats from its role as the guarantor of Pax Americana.
Right.
And they say that countries like India and China need to be ready to protect their own interests.
Because America might not be there to help.
Yeah, and the last line of your sources really sums it all up.
What is it?
The Great American Reset is now truly upon us.
Wow, so they're not mincing words.
Not at all.
Yeah, so for you, our listener, you've brought us these sources that describe some pretty dramatic changes happening in American foreign and domestic policy under President Trump's second term.
Trump 2.0.
Trump 2.0. And the sources are arguing that this is all happening because the old global order doesn't work for the U.S. anymore and because of the influence of this supposed Anglo-American oligarchy.
Right.
And they're saying that the consequences could be huge, a more global instability and major changes to American institutions.
Yeah, it's a really specific and thought-provoking perspective.
It is. And you came to us wanting to understand these forces that are shaping our world.
And these sources definitely offer a unique and compelling viewpoint.
They do. So now the question for you is, given all of this, what do you think are the most likely long-term consequences of this great American reset?
Yeah, will it lead to more cooperation or more conflict?
Or what will happen to national sovereignty?
And to really understand this even better, I think it's worth looking into the history of American foreign policy.
Absolutely.
And all the different theories about how global power works.
Because this is a really complex issue.
It is, and it's something that's going to affect all of us in the years to come.
That's great. So keep thinking, keep researching, and we'll see you next time.
See you later.
Bye.